I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Daniel. As I mentioned earlier, Michael was the White House security expert from 2012 to 2016 and currently president of the Cyber Threat Alliance. He's widely recognized as one of the world's top experts in managing cyber risk, specifically around critical infrastructure systems, financial service assets, electronic medical records, and industrial control systems. He's going to talk to you today about how you can effectively build your own cyber toolbox for your organization. Please join me in welcoming Michael Daniel.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ben, for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here this morning, despite the rain outside. And I'm happy to come and talk to you about cybersecurity and how you can actually make your organization more effective at it. As everybody in this room knows, we live in a digital age, right? This digital age has brought incredible advances in productivity. It's brought incredible advances in efficiency. It's brought vast social changes. I mean, the cat videos on the internet notwithstanding. But it's brought an enormous amount of benefits to us as a society. But at the same time, this digital environment in which we all find ourselves living has now brought with it some new challenges and potential vulnerabilities that, if we don't figure out a way to fix them, they threaten to undermine the very benefits that we've just been talking about. And in fact, our economies, our respective national security, our social lives all now depend so heavily on the internet and cyberspace that this becomes a really critical problem for us to address. So cybersecurity is now a hot topic, perhaps not as hot as some issues here in Washington, D.C. right now, but it's still one for which a lot of ink and electrons have been spilled. But for a lot of organizations, it can seem like the task is either hopeless, because you get sentiments like everyone gets hacked, or that old saw about, there are two kinds of organizations in the world, the ones that know they've been hacked and the ones that just don't realize it yet. So it can seem like something that is essentially impossible to deal with, or that it's impossible to understand. You get long-winded discussions from your security people about the number of appliances in the stack and whether or not the snort flabulator is tuned properly, that sort of thing. But neither of those conclusions is correct. You can actually take some steps to improve the cybersecurity of your organization. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how to do that. Now, I'm not going to make your eyes glaze over with a long list of technical specifications that have impenetrable acronyms, even for a cyber geek like me. Instead, I'm going to talk more about a mindset and an organizational approach to cybersecurity, because effective cybersecurity at its root requires an organizational approach, not just a technical one. But first, before we actually get into that, let's actually talk a little bit about why cybersecurity is actually hard. Because on the surface, it's not obvious. It's not obvious why I have a job. My wife has certain theories on that, but beyond that, it's not actually obvious why cybersecurity is such a difficult challenge. It's boxes, computers, it's technology, right? So why can't we just come up with a technical solution that solves the problem? Well, I think part of the issue is that fundamentally, cybersecurity is not just a technical problem. It is, in fact, actually an economic issue. It is a human psychology issue. It's a business process issue. It's a national security issue. It's all of those issues all rolled into one. And so as a result, when we try to apply purely technical solutions to something that is not just a technical problem, we fail. And as long as we keep trying to just apply technical solutions to this problem, we're going to continue to fail. So that's the first problem. The second problem for us is that, in essence, our mental models are all wrong for how we deal with cyberspace. The physics and math of cyberspace, the rules of cyberspace operate differently than the physical world. When I was in the White House, I frequently would get asked, well, why can't the federal government just do border security in cyberspace like they do in the physical world? I would get asked that by a lot of companies. Now, if you start to think about that for a little bit, we would have conversations like, okay, well, would you like NSA to have a few boxes on your network? Well, no. Well, would you like for us to build the great firewall of the United States? We've seen how that works over in China. We don't want that. And so the issues of near and far and speed and allocations of responsibility are different in cyberspace than they can be in the physical world. And we keep trying to use standard models, standard analogies from the physical world and just map them onto cyberspace. And that doesn't work. And then the third issue is just that this is still all really new. Although it seems like they've been around forever, my second grader is still older than the iPhone. These problems are new, particularly in a policy and legal sense. And while technology moves very rapidly, the legal frameworks that we have, the policy frameworks that we have, the social compacts that we have in order to actually deal with the problem don't move that fast. And so right now we're still in that stage where we have a misalignment between the policy, legal, and social frameworks that we use to tackle this problem. So as a result, cybersecurity actually is hard. And it's hard for a lot of organizations to deal with. Now it's also hard for another reason, which is that we tend to conflate all of the bad guys together. I often talk about the bad guys sort of generically because it's a useful shorthand, but the truth is they're very different kinds of bad guys, and what they're interested in is very different. And that means how we actually go about defending ourselves against them has to be different as well. So I generally talk about 4 different groups of bad guys out there. The first one of which I talk about are typically what I refer to as the hacktivists, the ones that are just out there for some cause, whether it's a formal cause that we would recognize or just themselves, they just want to cause mischief. They really aren't actually interested in stealing stuff or causing permanent destruction. They just want to generate publicity. Now, disruption is a perfectly fine achievement from their point of view, but they're not really interested in long-term destruction. Terrorist organizations are another group. Right now, they're fairly adept at using cyberspace to recruit new adherents and to get their message out. But they're actually pretty lousy at actual cyber operations. They can break in and steal stuff, but we've really seen little beyond that. Now, that said, they do have a lot of aspirations in this area, and that could change. My assessment would change if a nation state really got behind them and started pushing on and giving them some capabilities. But for right now, that's where they stand. Now, the next 2 groups are the ones that actually dominate what the malicious activity in cyberspace, and that's criminal organizations. These groups have moved into cyberspace in a big way, and they account for the largest chunk of malicious activity online. Now, they're in it for the money, right? And stealing money directly or stealing information that they can monetize in some fashion. But because they're in it for the money, cyber criminals will not expend an infinite amount of resources trying to get in someplace. Just like in the physical world, if they can't get in after some period of time, they'll move on. And that can shape how you think about doing your cyber defenses against those kinds of organizations. Now, the last group is nation states. Now, these organizations, these groups are in it to pursue their national interests, their national security interests, their national economic interest. They're doing it for espionage or to be able to hold another nation at risk to impose their will. And at the high end, these actors are the most sophisticated and hardest to deal with because they have lots and lots of patience. They have typically plenty of resources relative to cybersecurity, and they're willing to wait to achieve their goals in many cases. Now, if that array of bad guys weren't enough, I actually think the cybersecurity threat is becoming more acute in at least 4 fundamental ways that's shaping everything that we're dealing with. One of which is the cybersecurity threat is becoming broader. What do I mean by that? Well, we're increasingly connecting more and more devices to the internet. Indeed, just if you take Gartner's estimate, for example, by 2020, we'll have over 20 billion devices connected to the internet. And that, if you do the math, that translates into adding 10 million devices per day between now and 2020. And so what this means is literally we are making cyberspace bigger. Now, I don't know of any other domain in which we're actually making more of it at that pace. I mean, China's efforts to build islands in the South China Sea, or, Dubai creating little special islands aside, there's not generally more land. There's not more ocean. There's not more air on that scale on a daily basis. But we're expanding cyberspace in the domain that we're expected to protect on a daily basis, day in and day out. And now we're not just hooking up wired desktops. We're hooking up your refrigerator, your car, your Fitbit, your kids' toys. And all of these are different. All of these come with different security protocols. Most of them have no security. And they're very difficult to integrate and to talk to each other. So from a security standpoint. So we're making the problem a lot harder. The cyber threat is also becoming more prevalent because the number of malicious actors in cyberspace continues to grow. Everybody and their cousin is figuring out that they can get in and effectively pursue their interests in cyberspace relatively cheaply and effectively. The barriers to entry are low and the potential returns are very high. So as a result, the volume and frequency of malicious activity is increasing. The cyber threat is also becoming more dangerous. I mean, until recently, cyber actors generally limited their malicious activity to, simply stealing information. Or actually, when I first started doing this line of work 10, 11 years ago, we were talking a lot about website defacements. When was the last time anybody was really getting worked up about website defacements, right? So we've moved up the threat spectrum to where actors are considering and are willing to take acts that are actually destructive. Think like Sony Pictures, what happened to them, and what happened to the Ukrainian power grid. And finally, the cyber threat is becoming more disruptive. As we have become more and more digitally dependent, the potential impacts of a cyber incident increase. And it's becoming harder and harder for us to operate without the internet. Think about how many organizations now, if the internet actually goes down for an extended period of time, you just send people home. As a society, what would have been a nuisance, a few years ago, now could actually kill people. And so that's a big change in the threat perspective. So at this point, you might be wondering, why did they invite him to this conference? You can see why I was considered one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse on the NSC when I served there in the White House. In fact, when we had staff meetings, I would typically sit on the same side of the table as the person responsible for counterterrorism, the countering weapons of mass destruction, and the person that was responsible for dealing with natural disasters. Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor, would refer to us as the happy side of the table. But the truth is that the challenge is not impossible in this space. Now, I'm not going to give you an easy answer, and I'm not going to give you an answer that's going to work 100% of the time. In fact, I used to tell President Obama that if anyone showed up in his office and promised to solve the cybersecurity challenge to him with just one solution, he could probably just, he could throw them out or have the Secret Service throw them out of his office, right? Because they were either incompetent or they were selling snake oil. And I would make the same recommendation today. So building your cyber toolbox is more complex than just picking a technological solution. And just like your home toolbox wouldn't be very useful if all it had were screwdrivers in it, your cyber toolbox is going to have to involve several different kinds of tools. Now, some of those are technological, but most are mindset or organizationally related. So the first thing that I would say is the first step is broadening your mindset. Stop treating cybersecurity like it's a purely technical problem. And most organizations I've seen have gone through this. They want to they've recognized that cybersecurity is a problem, but they would like to really make it the IT shop's problem or the CISO's problem, or preferably the geek in the closet that they never actually have to talk to. But that's not going to work. You have to change your framing of the problem. And if you begin to frame the problem as one of risk management that your organization has to tackle over time and that you have to manage over time, then you'll start to actually gain traction with it. And if you look at how your company is organized to deal with cybersecurity, then you can adopt structures and policy that actually meaningfully impact that risk, just like you can with your legal risk, just like you can with your brand risk, just like you can with any other risk that you face. You can focus the C-suite's time and attention on this issue as the second step. I've seen this over and over again in organizations that I've worked with. Once the CEO and other senior officials start taking cybersecurity seriously and engage regularly on the topic, the organization's cybersecurity improves, even if they don't do anything else. Now, I don't think you should stop there because it's insufficient, but I've seen that actually start to happen. If you don't treat it seriously from the top, no one else will. And it's only when people get the signal from the top that they start to act. So be active on this topic. Put it on the agenda at the senior staff meetings. Discuss the status of your organization's cybersecurity on a regular basis. Discuss it with the board. Ask questions of the people you've assigned primary responsibility for different aspects of the problem. And not just your CISO, but the human resource lead, the general counsel, all the folks in your organization. And force them to do it in English. I know that's a challenge, but it can be done. And it actually shows whether or not they really understand the issue. The third step that I would recommend is adopting a holistic risk management framework. Since cybersecurity, as I've been saying, is not just a technical problem, you need a framework that is not purely technical. Now, my personal favorite is the National Institutes of Standard and Technology, NIST's cybersecurity framework of standards and best practices, primarily because NIST industry developed that under NIST's leadership as a result of an executive order that I helped draft for President Obama. So I like that one, but there are a bunch of them out there. But NIST framework is well recognized as an industry standard. And it's not a how-to guide for your IT folks. It's actually aimed at the executive level. And it provides a way to think about cybersecurity from a risk management perspective. And if you adopt the framework, it's going to take you through about 5 steps. The first one of which is identify. Know what information you have and why you care about it, what you're protecting it from. Some information you care about actually people seeing it. Some information you're actually more concerned about people changing it. And that shapes how you should think about the importance of that information to your organization. This step is the hardest, and it's the one that people like the least. And naturally, of course, it's the one that pays the most dividends down the road. I use this, the example I use, despite the risk of using physical analogies, the example I use is this is like the equivalent of painting a room. The fun part is going in and slapping the paint on the wall. The identify part is the part that nobody likes to do. It's actually taping the baseboards, taking the faceplates off and taping them off and lining. Yeah, that's the identify step, right? It's not very sexy, but it's the part that actually makes the later steps all work. The second step in the framework is protect. And that's what most people think of as cybersecurity, but there's actually a lot of different ways to actually engage in this. And it's going to take some work within your organization to figure out what the right combination is. The third step is detect, being able to identify anomalous behavior on your network. And then, that involves also doing some penetration testing and adopting those kinds of tools. The fourth one is respond. So being able to respond quickly when events occur. If you were watching some of the slides up there, earlier, they were noting that the typical time to detect bad activity on your network is 170 days, and then it's usually several more days or weeks to actually get the response in place. That's forever in cyberspace terms. It might as well just say infinity for the amount of time that has. So we definitely want to get those times down. And then the last step within the framework is recover. It's actually having put in place the capabilities to be able to reconstitute yourself and your business operations when that bad day happens. Now, if you adopt a framework like this, it can help you start to sort out how to allocate resources. And it may be the case that the marginal return on your dollar is not for another technical gadget or another appliance in the stack. It may well be in a robust recovery capability. It might be an employee training program. It might be cyber insurance. But by adopting a risk management framework, that's how you can actually start to figure out how to do that for your organization and base it on something other than a marketing pitch. So the fourth item in the toolbox is communication. It's communicating the framework that you've adopted, your priorities to your organization. Your management team and other managers in the organization have to know what your priorities are. And I've seen this error over and over again. When we started working on establishing the high-value assets for the federal government civilian agencies, and we went in and we asked the IT people what they thought the high-value assets were for an organization. And then we went in and we asked the business line managers what the high-value assets were for the organization. And then when we asked the deputy secretary or secretary of the agency what the high-value assets were for the agency, I didn't just get 3 answers. I got like 5 different answers, right? And it was apparent that there was not a lot of communication happening about what the actual things were that mattered to the organization. And so that's a very important step to make sure that all of that gets communicated up and down your organization. Fifth, you're going to need to select some performance metrics and measure them and adjust them over time. And you can't just fire and forget on cybersecurity. It's not a one-time thing. You have to manage the risk actively over time. Now, I have a whole other talk on like cyber metrics because we suck at them right now. In general, our industry is not very good at measuring cybersecurity-ness. We try to, people are still sort of locked in this, like we're trying to get to what, how many attacks have we stopped, how many penetrations have we stopped. And the problem is we'll never know the denominator. So that's a useless metric. So we're going to have to come up with some other things, and we can talk a little bit about what those might be, if you like. Sixth is developing an incident response plan and practicing it. Your organization should have one of those because you'll never drive this risk to zero. And so at some point, you're going to have a bad day. And that bad day will not be nearly as bad if you have a plan that's ready for how you're going to deal with it. And it's one that involves more than just your technical people. It has to involve all the different aspects of your organization. When I dealt with the OPM intrusion, I spent very little time. I spent probably, of the 6 months that was an active issue that I was spending a huge chunk of my time on, I probably spent 2 weeks of that on the technical aspects. Most of my time was spent on how are we going to talk to the workforce? How are we going to brief Congress? What are we going to do with the media? All of those kinds of questions that had nothing to do with the technical aspects of what actually happened in there. So that incident response plan needs to have all of those different aspects to it, and you need to practice it. I've definitely seen those organizations, one of which will remain nameless, but they discovered when they actually had to activate their response plan that their backup server was sitting next to their primary server on the same power circuit. Now, we all laugh, but I've been through this even in my own organization in figuring out where we had stupidity like that. And the only way you find that is to actually, you can either go through a crisis or you can drill it. And so it's really important to practice those plans. Seventh, you should actually hold people accountable. Now, you know this instinctively, but a lot of people find it hard to hold folks accountable because you can't drive the risk to zero. And so if you adopt a kind of zero failure mindset, what you're going to get is people covering up problems. And I've seen that in organizations too. And that's a recipe for disaster. But you can hold people accountable. So you can't hold them accountable for zero incidents, but you can hold them accountable for implementing the framework that you've chosen, hitting the performance metrics that you've chosen. You can reward them actually for finding vulnerabilities and fixing them. You can focus on that as a problem. In fact, towards the end of the administration, President Obama started bringing this up in his meetings with cabinet secretaries, even when we didn't prep him to do that. He would start asking them questions about where they were with their cybersecurity, which the cabinet secretaries found very annoying, and their staffs would then call me and say, "Why didn't you tell us the president was going to bring it up?" It's because I didn't know. And he's the president. He's allowed to talk about whatever he wants. But it was something that he started doing, and therefore the departments and agencies started responding because secretaries really didn't like coming back from the Oval having been raked over the coals a little bit about what was happening in cybersecurity. As a result, there were some CISOs that actually met their secretaries for the first time, but that was a kind of just an extra added benefit. Now, you're not in this alone as an organization, and this is where I think I'll make the clear connection to what you're going to talk about today, which is that you are most assuredly going to have to be working across organizational boundaries to tackle this problem. You're going to be having to seek outside expertise and capabilities in order to address this problem. Now, every organization is going to have to choose how much to do in-house and how much to outsource, how much to take to the cloud, how much to keep on premises. But even the largest organizations call on vendors for products, at least. Nobody does all of this on their own. The cloud is actually a very good solution for many, many organizations. The companies that, like AWS and Azure and the others that specialize in this, they put gigantic resources into securing their infrastructure on a scale that almost nobody else can manage or even replicate. And so as a result, the cloud is a very good example of a solution that works very well for most organizations and ends up boosting their cybersecurity considerably as an extra added benefit to all the sort of work process and business process advantages that it has. So I think that's a really important factor to make sure that you're consciously choosing how you seek that outside expertise. And then ninth, you should join an information sharing organization of some kind that's relevant to your business operations. Now, I know that there's a lot of these starting to spring up, and some are certainly more useful than others, but I think it still makes sense to belong to at least one of these groups. First off, it's just good to know you're not in it alone. But the better ISAOs help you understand the threats as they emerge and provide you with specific best practices to thwart that threat. Now, a common problem for organizations is, sharing information once they're in one of those groups. But I would argue that, that you should not let that fact stop you from looking at how an ISAO can help you. There are challenges with all of that. The ISAOs expect those challenges, and they have ways to help you work through them. And overall, the benefits far outweigh the costs. And then the last thing in the toolbox is relationships with law enforcement and network defenders. You really need to be establishing those relationships ahead of time. The last thing you want to be doing in the middle of a crisis on a bad day is exchanging business cards with the FBI field office because you finally had to call them in. That is not when you want to be doing that. You want to have that relationship built up ahead of time. And to the extent you can do that, it will make that bad day slightly less bad. Now, the cyber threats that we face are very serious. It's very, very serious. And for over 40 years, we've used the internet to drive, and cyberspace to derive enormous economic benefits, enormous social benefits, enormous national security benefits. But as I said at the beginning, if we don't start to tackle some of these problems, those benefits could really wither. And that's not a future that we want. So tackling this challenge effectively will require organizations to adopt a new mindset and change old beliefs to reflect the realities of the modern threat environment. And it's going to require forging new partnerships within industry, within new organizational structures within companies, partnerships within industry, between industries, and between industry and government. And it's going to require coordinated action to reinforce market forces and behavior. So I hope that I've spurred some of your thinking this morning, and I hope that I've set the stage well for your discussion that you're about to have on cloud and cloud security here. I think if you adopt some of the tools that I was talking about this morning, you can make your organization more resistant to cyber intrusions. And you can't beat and more resilient to the ones you can't stop. You can't beat all the intruders all of the time, but you can defeat some of them, frustrate most of them, and contain the rest. Now, you may think that I'm a pessimist on all of this, but that's not true. Fundamentally, I actually am an optimist. Humans built cyberspace, and we, in effect, created these problems, and that means we can fix them, and I'm confident of that. So thank you for your time today, and I think if we have time for a question or two, I'm happy to do that. Any questions from the audience?
I do have a question. So, knowing that there's a big push to go to the cloud because of the scalability and its efficiency and how it can take some of the workload off of it and keep things more up to date, and the mindset change in all of the organizations has to play a part. People wanting to go is something that's not an issue, I'm finding. They want to go. It's just the effort, the level of effort to getting there and getting people to try to understand the huge amount of effort. And it's not just a lift and shift of what you have. How did you manage to, or do you know of any best ways to try to get people to get through that understanding that it's not a lift and shift? It's not I go to sleep one night and I wake up and it's going to be an Amazon and everything's perfect. There's going to be some reconfiguring of your applications, some redesigning, and even some stuff will still not be able to go because it's not suited. Everything is not suited for Amazon or for the cloud, period.
Yeah, we found, and I have much more experience on movement to the cloud from the federal government side. We found that it was kind of like doing it was kind of like actually moving office buildings. We actually found that it required a tremendous amount of communication. So laying out a plan and then walking both senior management and the entire workforce through a lot of the steps that were going to be required, and in doing a lot of engagement work around the plan from beginning to end. And we actually had to work at sort of taking the plan out of the tactical steps and making it understandable to the broader audience, but then also clearly articulating some of the benefits that we thought that could be derived for the business operations, and not focusing on sort of the back-end IT efficiency or even the security aspects, although those were important and sort of reasons that you're doing it, but for the people actually on the computers in their cubes or their desks or whatever, focusing on the benefits to their business processes was what generally we found worked better to generate the support that we were looking for. Sure.
I like the analogy, but I almost think it's more instead of moving office buildings, it's moving countries. Because
yes.
You know how everything works. You know that the power is the same whether you go to New York or D.C.
Right.
But if you go to another country, the power is different.
Yep.
So going to the cloud, you have a different terminology.
Trying to read those annoying European labels on the food in the supermarket. Yeah.
So if you don't have a good process in your current environment, when you take it to the cloud, then you find out all the holes that you have in your current process on site.
That's
Yeah.
an opportunity.
Yeah.
That's right.
Lift and shift.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity for you to upgrade,
Correct.
correct, and also address your threats.
Yeah, that's right. If you just pave the electronic cow paths, that's not that's not terribly useful. Yeah.
Points you made, a lot of people may see those, may give it lip service, but then when they actually have to do it, then they find out, oh wait, we didn't do this, and like you said, opportunity for improvement in their current environment.
Sure.
Do you tend to see in transition to the cloud, people slowly transitioning by taking their web tier there first and leaving the application layer and the database layer back home, and then just do some services, and then slowly transitioning to the next layer and the next layer? I have a huge challenge in moving the data services to the cloud. So there's a big push in our organization to just decouple the application so that we can slowly transition to the cloud. Is that anything?
Yeah, I've seen the Big Bang models. I've seen the ooze into the cloud model, and I think honestly I've kind of decided that some of that is really going to be organizationally dependent, and based on the kind of data and business operations that you have. I mean, in general, I have found that, and again, my experience is largely with the federal government, where we like to do everything slowly over extended periods of time. So, generally I was sort of harassing agencies to move faster, but that's because they were moving glacially slowly. But certainly I think, it's the most important thing is to have a disciplined plan for how you're going to do it, and then really work to stick to that plan. Because taking bits and pieces of the business process and putting them in the cloud and not others comes with its own set of problems, as you're probably well aware. So it's just really, you have to do that trade-off on an organizational basis. And I've seen both models fail, and I've seen both models succeed. Sure.
What are your views on FedRAMP?
So FedRAMP was a necessary step for the federal government to start to actually get its arms around how it could think about in an organized fashion moving to the cloud. Now, I think FedRAMP itself, now that both the cloud service providers have matured considerably and the federal government's understanding of its own cybersecurity have matured considerably, it's time to take a relook at FedRAMP and look at some ways to speed that process up, because it's, like a lot of things, really annoying and slow. But I think the fundamental principles behind it are the right ones. It just needs to be re-engineered itself. But it was actually a pretty big step forward for the time when it came out. I guess time for one last question, if there are any. All right. Oh, yes.
One quick one. You talked about the 4 different types of actors. Did you see the technology that they use and the techniques that they use migrate from group to group? So what happens with the state actors who are somewhat less sophisticated, does that technology and those techniques trickle down to the other groups?
So actually, where we see a lot of the technology sort of emerging out of is from the criminal organizations, and most of the nation states make use of the criminal tools. Now, they have their own tools, but they often don't bother using them. Why use the graduate level tool when the elementary school tool will do? And besides which, it gives you, plausible deniability that it was you to begin with. So generally, most of that's coming out of the criminal world. And yes, and then the hacktivists and the terrorists sort of pick up on those tools. But definitely there's a lot of sharing among all the groups. The malicious actors do a very good job of information sharing, and they spread it very, very rapidly, and are very good at sharing tools very widely. Well, thank you very much for letting me come and speak with you this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity.